Hi everyone, Izza here, back with another video. I know it's been a while since I uploaded properly, but I am back with a pretty exciting project. This video will cover the process of how I made 100 of these beautiful little cameos in 3 different colour schemes for Studio Cut to Bits to promote their new game, Venture to the Vile. Venture to the Vile is a spooky Metroidvania inspired by Victorian England. You explore a 3D world by weaving through the multiple layers of 2D gameplay, defeating bosses, absorbing their powers, and discovering the quirky townsfolk of Rainybrook, as well as the mysteries of the Vile. Cut to Bits reached out to me and asked me to make these cameos, which will be attached to card cases for their content creator kits, which are going out to streamers and influencers right now. And if you want the chance to win one of the kits, which includes my cameo card cases, then watch to the end of the video to see how you can do that. For now though, let's get on with the build. For the design of the cameo, I took inspiration from Venture to the Vile key art, combining the main character's deer mask with a swirling vine pattern based on the Vile itself. The game's Victorian-inspired visuals also inform the design too, with the idea for the cameo being based on engraved cameo brooches. I made a rough breakdown of the different layers of the cameo to help me when I 3D modelled the piece. The final cameos are going to be set onto card cases like this one, so I only need to 3D model the cameo itself, which I did using Nomad Sculpt on my iPad. I started by creating a reference base the same dimensions as the card case. I then built up the cameo frame surrounding the deer layer by layer, according to the breakdown I made earlier. I did this by drawing a mask in the shape of that layer, and then extracting that mask to make it its own 3D layer in the shape that I want. I then go back to the base layer and redraw the mask for the next layer. Then extract that. I extract the layers at slightly different thicknesses to give the impression that all of the different parts of the vines are growing up and around each other. Once I had drawn and extracted all the layers of the outer cameo, I added a primitive sphere which I roughly sculpted into the deer's face, so I knew how much space it was going to take up. I then went back to finishing the outer cameo, adding and refining details on the sculpt. When I was happy with it, I merged all the layers of the outer cameo together. Then I continued sculpting the deer's head. I refined the primary forms and added the ears using more sphere primitives. Then I used primitive cylinders to block out the antlers. And just kept refining all the details of the sculpt. Like adding the seam line down the middle of the head and the stitches. A frilled border around the deer's face. And the grooves in the antlers. When I was finished with all the sculpting, I merged all of the different sections, except for the base, together into one single piece. Once I've got the finished cameo all merged together, I voxel remesh it with the base, while the base is set as hidden. When I remesh it like this, it removes the base layer, along with anything that exists beyond that point, which leaves me with a lone cameo with a flat back. And thus my 3D model is done and ready to be sent to print. Now you might be wondering why I wouldn't just 3D print all 100 of these, and that's because with 3D prints I would have to sand and finish the fronts of all the prints to get rid of all the print lines. So instead of having to do that, I decided to 3D print 2 master copies which I would sand and finish, and then I would be able to mold those pieces later, and every time I cast them I only have to finish the backs, not the fronts. And you'll also see how that enabled some of the other aspects of this build later on. These pieces are being printed in water-washable resin, so I'm wearing my respirator and gloves while handling the uncured resin. I'll get more into safety when working with resin later. When the cameos are printed, I remove them from the plate and soak them in water for a bit to clean off some of the residue resin. Then I remove the support structures. To finish cleaning them, I wash them off under running water, and when they're dry, I cured them under a UV lamp. Then I sprayed them with filler primer. I used wet and dry sandpaper to sand off the backs, as well as any print lines on the fronts. The filler primer reacts with the water and sanding to fill in the print lines. When I was happy with them, I sprayed them again with a regular primer to make sure I had an even finish. And now I have my 2 master cameos ready to mold. I'm going to make 5 molds so that I can cast in batches of 5 rather than slowly one at a time. These are going to be 1-part silicone molds, and to start with I need to make a box mold to pour that silicone into. I cut out foam board bases and walls measured to size. I stick the piece I'm molding onto the foam board base with double-sided tape. Then I build the mold wall around it with more foam board, which I hot glue into place. I also add more hot glue onto the outside of all the joining points, so there's no spots where silicone could leak out. Once I have my little mold boxes, I spray both the prints and the inner box with Maxil spray. This is a release agent specifically for use with silicone. I set this aside for 20 to 30 minutes before pouring the mold. Now let's talk silicone. The silicone I'm using is Platsil Gel 25, which I will pigment using a silicone pigment. And I also need mixing cups, mixing sticks, and a kitchen scale to weigh out my silicone, as well as some disposable brushes, which I forgot to include in the first shot. Silicone comes in 2 parts which are mixed together, the A part and the B part. I mark 3 mixing cups and corresponding mixing sticks, 1 for A, 1 for B, and 1 for the mixed silicone. I pour out my A and B silicone parts using the kitchen scale to make sure they are measured equally by weight. For these molds, I ended up using about 140 grams of each. Then I add some blue pigment to the B part and mix it in. I add the pigment to silicone molds because otherwise it will just be clear and it can be harder to see any imperfections in the mold. I pour the A and B into the 3rd cup and mix thoroughly. I only added pigment into 1 part so that when I mix the parts together I can gauge how well mixed the silicone is by how evenly distributed the colour is. When the silicone is mixed, I first brush silicone onto the 3D prints. I dab silicone into all those small detail areas, dragging it up over the print, popping any bubbles and making sure the whole piece is covered. Then when the piece is covered, I pour the rest of the silicone into the mold box. I like to pour from high up as it can help disperse and pop any bubbles. Once all the silicone is poured, I also tap the sides of the mold box to pop any remaining bubbles, and you can also use a mixing stick to pop bubbles that might rise to the surface when you do this. Once the silicone is fully set, I remove the foam board and pop out the 3D print. I trim any excess bits of silicone, and that's my mold. Then I repeat this process to make 5 total molds to work with. Next up, I'm going to be casting the final cameos in resin, which means it's time for a quick PSA about using resin safely. Uncured resin releases toxic fumes, which means it's very dangerous to breathe in, to work with, or be near without proper ventilation and PPE. So firstly, whenever I'm working with resin in my studio, I have the window wide open with a fan blowing air out that way. And I always wear nitrile gloves, a respirator fitted with organic vapor filters, eye protection, and I also put DermaShield cream on the exposed skin of my arms. This is really, really important, so please, if you are going to use resin yourself, do some research, buy the proper equipment, and just make sure that you are doing it safely. And with that, let's get back to the resin casting process. When I'm ready to cast out of these molds, I spray more Maxil mold release into them, but then dab some of the excess away and leave it to set for about 20 to 30 minutes. Just like with silicone, resin comes in 2 parts, a part A and a part B, which you mix together to activate it. The type of resin I'm using, which is by Resin G26, has you mix equal parts A and B by weight. For these casts, I'm also using a black pigment and brass cold casting powder, as well as the mold release, nitrile gloves, a scale, mixing sticks, plastic spoons and pipettes, mixing cups, and some little nail brushes. Now remember, I'm making 3 different colour variants of these cameos, so I don't need all of the materials for all of the casts. because I'm doing an all black design and all gold design, as well as the black and gold design which I initially sketched. But I started with the all black cameos first. So again, I mark some mixing cups, smaller ones this time, for the A, B and mixed resin. These casts are very small, but they also have a lot of small detail areas which take time to cover, and this resin only has about 5 to 10 minutes of working time before it starts to harden. So I actually mix up my resin for one cast at a time, which means I'm only pouring about 5 grams each of A and B at a time, and have 5 cups of mixed resin on hand. For this type of resin, I add the black pigment into the A part. Then I mix them together. I first use a small brush to brush resin into all the tiny corners of the piece. Tilting the mold around and lightly tapping it onto the table also helps to reach all those small areas like the tips of the vines. Then I pour resin up to the top of the mold, give it a little tilt around, and set it aside to cure. Then I repeat for each of the 5 molds and wait until all of them have cured. Once the resin has cured, I can demold my 5 casts. These pieces have some small thin areas like the antler prongs and the vines, so I start by pulling away the silicone at the bulkier centre, and I'm extra gentle when pulling the cast out of those smaller areas. And then I just keep casting in batches of 5 until I have as many black cameos as I need. When I had all my black casts done, I started on the gold ones. I used brass powder to cold cast these pieces, which is a process where you use real metal powder embedded into the surface of a resin cast to give it a metallic finish. And half of these pieces will end up being painted partially black, but I'm starting from a cold cast brass powder surface for all of them. Now, you can just use the cold casting powder on the very surface of the piece, but I found through experimenting and some research that I do think it is better when you mix powder into the resin as well. It creates more depth to the overall metal look, as well as meaning that if there are any scratches or blemishes, there is still metallic shine underneath the very surface of the cast. It won't just look completely out of place all of a sudden. I spray mold release into the mold and dab it away just as before. Once the mold release has set, I then grab my brass powder and a little spoon. I generously dust brass powder onto each mold. Then I pick up each mold one at a time and tilt and tap them around over the brass powder tub. This moves the brass powder around to both cover the whole piece and knock out all of the excess powder, which then goes back into the tub when I can use it later. I do this until there's a thin coating of the brass powder over the whole mold. This powder is going to end up embedding into the resin as it cures and coating the entire surface of the piece. When it comes to mixing the resin, as with the black cameos, I pour up my parts A and B. And I still mix black pigment into the part A, though less of it for these ones. And I also fill another cup with brass powder, weighed to double the amount of the total resin weight. I then pour all parts into a cup and mix thoroughly. For pouring cold cast pieces, I don't want to use a brush to reach all those small areas because it could disturb the powder coating the mold. So this is where I use the pipettes to drop small amounts of the resin mixture into all of the extremities of the mold while tilting and tapping it against the table to really encourage it to drop into all those small pointed areas. And then I pour the rest of the resin in to fill the mold. I then leave these pieces to cure and demold them when they're ready. The cold cast pieces are more robust than the black pieces because of the metal inside the resin, but I'm still pretty careful when removing them from the mold. Right now they don't look very shiny or metallic, but trust me, when I buff these they are going to have a great metallic shine. But before I can do any buffing or painting, I need to sand down the backs of these casts and clean them up a bit. As you can see, the casts have some excess resin around the edges, so to even out the backs, I sand them all down until they're even. As a side note, I also wear a dust mask or my respirator with dust protectors on when I'm sanding down resin, as the dust is also toxic to breathe in. Then I clean off the cast with some IPA to get rid of any Maxil residue or leftover dust from the sanding. And now I can paint and finish these. The black cameos, well, they're already black, so I just sprayed them with a satin spray varnish to give them a slight sheen, and they're done. The gold ones have more work to get them finished though. I first wipe them down with some white spirit to start to bring out the sheen of the brass. Then I use steel wool to buff the gold cameos to bring out the shine of the brass powder. As you can see, this almost immediately brings out a really beautiful metallic shine on the surface of the cast. Just compare how it looks next to an unbuffed cameo. I buffed all of the gold cameos and then separated out the ones I was going to keep all gold. To weather the gold cameos, I used shoe polish. I stippled it all over the cameos with a chip brush and then dabbed the shoe polish away with paper towel, leaving black polish behind in all those deep crevices and detail areas. After letting the shoe polish sit for a while, I then sprayed the cameos with satin spray varnish to seal the shoe polish. And then the gold cameos were done as well. For the black and gold cameos, I take the rest of the buffed gold ones and I use some good quality black acrylic and a steady hand to paint the deer's face and antlers. I then weathered the black and gold cameos with shoe polish as well. And then sealed the paint and the shoe polish at the same time with more satin spray varnish. And with that, all of the cameos were done. In total, I made 100 of these cameos in 2 batches of 50. I really love how all of them turned out, but I think my favourites are personally the all gold cameos. I just really love that brass finish. I think it looks so great. I then packed up the finished cameos and posted them to Masal from Cut to Bits, who then glued them down onto the card cases, ready to be packed into the creator kits. I just want to thank Cut to Bits for asking me to work on this project. I had so much fun doing it and I loved how the cameos turned out. And of course, don't forget to check out Venture to the Vial because I know I will be. And if you want to see more cosplay and crafting videos from me, then subscribe to my channel. And you can also find more of my work on Twitter, Instagram, and now TikTok at EvilCleverDog. Thank you so much for watching and I will see you next time.